took the stuff and with the hammer just crushed it down. Just simply crushed it down, ending it down. And then either with this block area or with this hammer, depending, and you just literally grind the stuff down. A traditional thing to use was a block of hard stone on a. You used the stone which had no reaction with the pigment and didn't absorb the pigments. So you use a very hard piece of granite or something. Just gather the material back in. So you've actually gone from this to this. Virtually everywhere that the ochres occurred, there was an ochre mill or grinding plant. Where this came from Avoca in County Wicklow, and there's actually even on the Ordnance Survey map you have a site designated the ochre mill, and it's still called the ochre mill. It's still known as the ochre mill locally, and it was a byproduct of the copper mines and the sulphur. In the same mines they actually took copper and sulphur, and it peaked. The mines there peaked when with the blockade by Napoleon of Britain, because the sulphur. They were before that getting sulphur from Sicily. With the blockade by Napoleon, then the mines there actually peaked in their production because they could produce sulphur. Copper and sulphur. Copper was the least important. They were producing sulphur. And nearly all the pigments are an oxide of iron or metal. Virtually all.
And to get them to their very finest condition, you should actually grind these with water. Usually it takes about several hours of fine grinding in the mortar and pestle to get it down fine enough to actually go through the paint. You can imagine you don't want lumps of material lying on the surface of your finished wall, but they can be ground down to an extraordinarily fine size. They can actually be ground down much finer than talcum powder. And when they're like that, of course, that's the perfect pigment for lime wash.
One of the traditional pigments you got in Ireland was a thing called, it was culum, which was a coal, a waste product from the coal. It was the slack like this from the coal, which they took and they mixed it with clay, ordinary clay, to make it into a ball, which they call bums, coal bum, and they burned it in the fire. And the clay then burned in the burning in the fire as an old-fashioned briquette in the fire. When the clay then turned red, it was like brick, but it wasn't fired hard enough to become a brick. So you actually ended up with a red powder, which they then used in lime washes as well in areas. So that's generally all the pigments were local pigments, not necessarily. But then once transport became available, people brought in exotic pigments from outside because fashions changed, like the fashion. I mean,
West coast of Scotland and Ireland had a great trading history with North Africa and Portugal because they were used to the longships. It's quite strange because in the west coast of Scotland we have much more vibrant colours than we do in the east coast of Scotland. That's because the longships used to travel up and down into the more exotic parts. And in fact, if you go up to look at some of the Fair Isle sweaters, they're actually North African and Spanish in influence. They're nothing to do with Scotland at all. And the colour schemes are all North African in origin. The colours are phenomenal. So the colour schemes in Ireland and the west coast of Scotland are much more vibrant. And in Cornwall, the Cornish were the same, and the Welsh. So that west side of the UK and Ireland was a much more vibrant, much more colourful culture than our dull eastern side of the country. We had no road transportation links with the west coast of Scotland. It was sea transportation or nothing else, and that's why they had that better transport links with Europe than they did with us.
But certain parts of the country had traditional colours, like traditionally in Cork you get a pink colour. In Limerick, nearly all of Limerick is a yellow colour. You had a blue in Clare, because these were the local pigments or muds from, in some cases, muds from the river, which settled out. You see, you find in parts of the river where they're washing through a mine that you'll get a settlement of a very fine pigment just in an area. It's just a mud, and in fact they say that the mud in Limerick was Dulla, from the Dulla River, Dulla mud they call it, which is a yellow pigment, and it's still very common in Adair, in the village of Adair, which is one of the, probably one of the prettiest villages in Ireland. It's still the Adair colour, it's still the same yellow used. Oh, we've been supplying lime for about 17 years, but we've done hydraulic lime for the last 7 years. But we've been supplying lime products for about 18 years.
Yeah, I started building the castle walls doing exactly this sort of thing. 200 tonnes of quicklime at a time, which is an awful lot of quicklime. And as Edward says, it's 3 times the volume of sand, so you can imagine it's a hell of a lot of sand that goes with it. So, but massive structures require massive amounts of material. So, yeah, 20 years at least, maybe slightly longer. I would say 20 years. And then we've been supplying lime for the same sort of period.
We actually used lime on our own house, but in that case we made up a ready-mix mortar, but we gauged it with a very, very tiny amount of cement, which is not, at the time, was the accepted practice, because we'd all sort of forgotten that the Continentals had never abandoned hydraulic lime. But the rest of Britain and Ireland seemed to have abandoned hydraulic lime. And about 7 years ago, Douglas Hugh started with hydraulic lime, what, about 10?
We actually started hydraulic lime in 1995, 10 years ago. That coming up for 11 years ago. Yeah. All the lime in Scotland is hydraulic lime. There's no such thing as pure limes in Scotland, so we've been always using hydraulic limes. We were burning our own limestone from England, which was feebly hydraulic, and eventually we started importing lime from Switzerland and then France, and we've been bringing in lime from Switzerland, France, Germany and Portugal ever since. And the use of Portland cement has been commonplace in new builds since maybe the mid-60s, where architecture changed, people built high-rise concrete flats, and cavity wall construction, great social change after the war. The building process changed fundamentally, so it wasn't that there was any lack of quality in the material. It was just a different type of building style, and you needed a different building product. So you think about somebody that's served their time in the 60s, they'll have grown up learning to use a completely different technique and different building materials. They're still good tradesmen, they're still basically skilled enough. All they need to do is understand the slight nuances and the differences in the way the materials are applied and how they're handled. And we don't find any difficulty with that at all. We teach people to use lime on a weekly basis. We've had more than 6,000 people through our centre at Charlestown, and none of the tradesmen that come there have any difficulty in using lime.
It's getting thicker, is it? Yeah. Do you want to send it a unit? How does that work? So we want you to strain some of this off and make sure there's no lumps in it.
Traditionally, they even people staking on site, they used to, in parts of Britain, they used to put anything like a Cornish pasty into the hot mortar to actually heat it up. Anybody who says he's a plasterer or can't use lime is not a plasterer. The real skill is in the correct gauging, mixing, and selection of the lime and the aggregates. Cement is such a, for want of a better word, forgiving material. I mean, even if you get the mix wrong, it will still work, simply because it's way off the scale of strength and hardness compared to lime. But for lime to work, you must use the correct ratios and gauge it correctly. That's the real skill, learning how to mix and gauge the mortar, not actually using. Anybody who's a plasterer and says they can't use lime, then they're not a plasterer. In fact, most plasterers love it once they get used to it, because it's such a... See, the root meaning of the word lime is the sticky stuff, and up to very recently, until the advent of all these additives for cement plasters, lime was actually used as the plasticizer, as to make cement mortar sticky. Because if you try to use a Portland cement mortar as is, it's impossible to use. It's really raw. But as soon as you add lime, it becomes the sticky stuff. It becomes very, very nice. And the real problem actually with mortars is not actually the cement. The real problem with modern mortars are the additives, because the additives are misused. I don't think if you went onto any site anywhere where there's a site mixed mortar that they're actually making the correct mortar, cement or lime. They're never being made correctly. The manufacturers of the cement wouldn't even agree with the mixes they're using, because they think if 1 joule of cement is good, 2 is even better, 3 will get us out here at 4 o'clock, and with 4 it will be finished at lunchtime. And that's the problem we see on sites, that they're using completely incorrect mixes.
Per capita, the amount of lime that's used in the Republic of Ireland is probably greater per head than in any part of the UK. We use about a similar amount in Scotland as a function of our population. So between the Republic of Ireland and Scotland, slightly smaller communities, the adoption of traditional building practice has never been quite so complex. And there's not the same pressure on new build in Scotland that there is in England, of course, and that's actually probably been a big break on the the extensive use of lime in England, but it's certainly growing very quickly, and everybody now accepts it's the right.